That morning, my daughter told me she had an urgent appointment and would be away all day. The moment her car disappeared behind the gate, a mysterious delivery man appeared and placed an old package in my hands with a trembling handwritten note for the judge only. Inside was a photo of the housekeeper who had been fired after my wife's death, a USB drive, and a letter I don't have much time left. The truth about that night is inside. I opened the USB and my entire world collapsed. If this story already has your heart, welcome. I'm so grateful you're here with Revenge Dad today. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from, what city, what country? Let's see how far this story travels. Please note, this story contains fictional elements created for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarity to real names or places is coincidental, but the message it carries is something worth keeping. I used to tell young lawyers that the most dangerous moment in any case was not the verdict. It was the silence before the evidence was opened, that hollow, breathless second when a man still believed his life was intact. On the morning of October 9th, 2025, I learned what that silence felt like from the other side. The coffee had gone cold before I even tasted it. That had been happening more often lately. I would pour a cup, set it on the side table beside my reading chair, and then spend an hour staring out the window at the oak trees Eleanor planted along the back fence the year we moved in. 40 years those trees had grown. They were taller than the roofline now, broad and certain, in a way I no longer felt myself to be. "Dad?" Claire's voice came from the hallway, bright and practiced the way a morning news anchor sounds cheerful regardless of the headlines. She appeared in the doorway of my study, dressed for the office. Her dark coat already buttoned, her hair, pinned back in the way Eleanor used to say, made her look like a courthouse lawyer. "You're up early." "I never really slept," I said. She crossed the room and kissed my cheek, quick, efficient, like checking a box on a list. "You should call Dr. Harmon about that. Insomnia at your age can affect your memory, your judgment." She said it gently, the way you might say it to a child. She said it the way she had been saying things to me for months, each sentence a small brick in a wall I had not yet understood she was building. "I'll think about it," I said. She picked up her bag from the armchair where she had left it the night before. "I may be late tonight. Daniel and I have dinner with a colleague." She paused at the door. "There's soup in the refrigerator. Don't forget to eat." "Okay. You've been forgetting." "I haven't been forgetting," I said, but she was already gone. The front door closed, her car started in the driveway, and I was alone again in the house that Eleanor and I had filled with 30 years of ordinary, irreplaceable life. I set down the cold coffee and walked to the mantel above the fireplace. Eleanor's photograph stood there in the silver frame her sister had sent after the funeral. Eleanor at 63 laughing at something just outside the frame, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the way she always wore them when she forgot where she had put them. I touched the edge of the frame with 2 fingers. The glass was cool. "Good morning, Ellie," I said quietly. The doorbell rang at 9:17. The man on the porch wore no company uniform, no name badge, no delivery logo on his jacket. He was perhaps 35, unremarkable in every way, holding a small brown package wrapped in plain paper. He handed it to me without a word, without asking for a signature, and walked back down the porch steps before I could say anything at all. By the time I stepped outside to call after him, the street was empty. I looked down at the package in my hands. The handwriting on the front was careful, deliberate, the penmanship of someone who had learned to write in a different era. For the Honorable Raymond Caldwell. "Open alone." I carried it inside. I locked the study door behind me. I sat at my desk with the package in front of me and told myself for exactly 30 seconds that it was probably nothing, a letter from an old colleague, a book from a former clerk, something ordinary and easily explained. Then I opened it. Inside the brown paper was a shoebox, and inside the shoebox were 3 things: a black USB drive no larger than my thumb, a photograph of Dorothy Pierce taken sometime in the last year or 2, judging by the white of her hair, and a cream-colored envelope sealed with a strip of tape that had begun to yellow at the edges. Dorothy Pierce. I had not spoken her name aloud in 5 years. She had been our housekeeper for 15 years, the woman who knew where Eleanor kept the spare keys, who made the coffee strong, the way I liked it, who had been standing in our kitchen the morning the paramedics carried Eleanor out on a stretcher. Claire had let her go 3 weeks after the funeral, said it was too painful to have her around, said they needed a fresh start. I had not argued. I had not argued about anything in those weeks. I had been too broken to argue about anything at all. My hands moved to the envelope. I broke the tape and unfolded 2 pages of lined notebook paper, the kind you buy in any drugstore. The handwriting matched the package, careful, deliberate, but shakier now, the letters of a woman fighting pain in her joints with every stroke of the pen. Your Honor, it began. I have carried this secret for 5 years. I am dying. The doctors say I have perhaps 6 weeks remaining, perhaps less. I cannot take what I know to my grave. I tried to convince myself that what I saw was not what I thought it was. I tried to convince myself that staying quiet was the same as doing no harm. I was wrong. Forgive me for waiting so long. Everything you need is on the drive. I am so sorry, Raymond. I am so deeply sorry. She had signed it with her full name, Dorothy Ann Pierce. I set the letter down on my desk. I picked up the USB drive and turned it over in my fingers. Outside the study window, the October morning continued without concern. Leaves blowing from the oak trees Eleanor had planted, a neighbor's dog barking twice, and then stopping the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood that did not know what was about to change. 35 years on the bench, thousands of cases. I had sat above defendants and victims and witnesses and attorneys, and never once allowed myself to flinch from evidence, no matter how terrible, because flinching served no one. Truth did not become more merciful simply because you looked away from it. I opened my laptop. I pushed the USB drive into the port. A single folder appeared on the screen. Inside the folder was a single video file. The file name read, Eleanor Stairs, Oct. 15, 2020. October 14th, 2020. The day my wife died. My finger hovered over the touchpad. A career spent hearing testimony taught me that some truths once seen could never be unseen. I pressed play. The video was 4 minutes and 37 seconds long. I know because I watched it 11 times. Each time I told myself I had misread the angle of the light, or misunderstood the motion of 2 bodies in a hallway, or allowed grief to distort what was plainly an accident. Each time the recording corrected me with the patience of something that had been waiting 5 years to be believed. Dorothy had mounted the camera herself. I could tell by the angle, slightly crooked, tucked into the bookshelf at the top of the landing, where Eleanor kept the old encyclopedias neither of us had opened since the internet made them obsolete. The device was small enough to disappear between 2 thick volumes, its lens no wider than a shirt button. Claire had never had reason to search that shelf. As far as she knew, the only witness that night had been a frightened old housekeeper whose silence had already been purchased. The lens faced down the staircase. The timestamp in the lower right corner read October 14th, 2020. 11:43 in the evening. Eleanor appeared first. She came out of the master bedroom in her blue robe, the one with the fraying left cuff she always meant to repair, and never did, holding a sheaf of papers against her chest, the way she held things she considered important. Even in the grainy footage, I could see the tension in her shoulders, the stiffness in the way she moved down the hall. Eleanor was not a nervous woman by nature. In 40 years, I had watched her face down difficult news, difficult people, difficult seasons of our lives. What I saw in that footage was not nervousness. It was fear. Claire came from the other direction. They met at the top of the staircase. Claire was still dressed, which told me she had not been to bed yet, which meant she had been waiting. The 2 of them stood perhaps 3 feet apart, and whatever passed between them in those first seconds was spoken too quietly for the camera to catch. Then Eleanor held up the papers. Claire's body changed. There is no other way to describe it. She had been standing the way a person stands in the presence of someone older and beloved, slightly deferential chin tilted toward her chest. And then the papers appeared, and something in her simply closed. Her shoulders squared, her chin came up. The deference evaporated. They argued. I could not hear words, only rhythm, the short, sharp rhythm of accusation and denial, the same pattern I had watched play out in courtrooms for decades. Eleanor pointed at the papers twice. Claire shook her head. Eleanor stepped forward. Claire stepped back. And then Claire stepped forward. One motion, less than a second. A single forward movement of her right hand against Eleanor's shoulder. Eleanor fell backward down the staircase. The sound, even through the small laptop speakers, even after 5 years, was the worst thing I had ever heard in my life. I pressed the spacebar and stopped the video, and sat at my desk with both hands pressed flat against the wood surface and breathed through my mouth until the ringing in my ears subsided. My wife had not slipped. My wife had not lost her footing in the dark. My wife had been pushed by the woman we had brought home as a 5-year-old child and raised and loved and celebrated through 25 years of birthdays and graduations and holidays and ordinary dinners at this same kitchen table where I now sat unable to feel my hands. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. I wanted to cry. I could feel the grief pressing up behind my sternum like water behind a dam. But the part of me that had spent 35 years keeping composure in the face of terrible testimony held the dam in place. Grief was not what this moment required. Clarity was. I forced myself to press play again. After Eleanor fell, the camera showed Claire standing at the top of the staircase looking down. She stood there for 11 seconds, I counted them, and then she turned and walked back toward her bedroom. Not running, not panicking, walking, her hands at her sides. I closed the laptop. I picked up Dorothy's letter and read the second page, which I had not yet finished. Dorothy described what she had seen from the bottom of the stairs. That night she had been in the kitchen, heard the argument started toward the landing, arrived in time to see Eleanor at the bottom of the steps. She described calling 911, described staying with Eleanor until the paramedics arrived, described the way Claire came downstairs 20 minutes later, composed and red-eyed, and already telling the story of an accident with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it. Dorothy wrote, "She came to my room the following week. She put an envelope on my dresser. She told me if I ever repeated what I thought I had seen, she would ensure I had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I was 65 years old. I had no family. I took the money. I have hated myself every day since." I set the letter down and opened the desk drawer and took out the family photograph I kept there. The three of us, Eleanor and Claire, and I taken at Claire's college graduation in 2017. Eleanor was laughing. Claire had her arm around my shoulder. I was looking at the camera with the expression of a man who believed without question that his life had turned out well. I turned the photograph face down on the desk. "What did you find, Ellie?" I said to the empty room. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "What were those papers?" Because I had watched the video 11 times, and each time I had looked not only at Claire's hand against Eleanor's shoulder, but at Eleanor's hands, and Eleanor had been holding those papers against her chest when she fell, and those papers had scattered across the lower landing. And in the footage I could see Claire descending the stairs calmly and gathering every single page before the paramedics arrived. Whatever Eleanor had discovered that night, Claire had taken it back. I stood up from the desk. My knees ached the way they always did in October. The old injury from a fall I had taken during a hiking trip with Frank Doyle back in '98, making itself known the way old injuries did, reliably without mercy. I walked to the window. The oak trees moved in the morning wind. "I hear you," I said quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner. I made myself breathe. I made myself think. 35 years on the bench had given me one skill above all others, the ability to feel the full weight of something terrible and still function. Still reason, still build toward a conclusion, rather than collapse under the premise. I could not call the police, not yet. A video recorded by a housekeeper on an uncertified device with no established chain of custody. Any competent defense attorney would have it excluded before lunch. I needed more. I needed to understand what Eleanor had found. And to do either of those things, I needed Claire to believe, at least for a little longer, that I was exactly the confused, grieving old man she had decided I was. I straightened my collar. I smoothed my hair. I walked to the kitchen and poured the cold coffee down the sink and made a fresh pot. When the front door opened 40 minutes later, and Claire stepped inside, home early without warning, her eyes moving immediately to the study door, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a warm cup in both hands, staring at nothing in particular, the way a tired old man stares when the morning has asked too much of him. "Ed," her voice carried a careful note of concern. "You okay? You look pale." I looked up at her and allowed my expression to do the work. The slight confusion, the slow blink, the half-smile of a man whose mornings had begun to blur together. "I was just thinking about your mother," I said. "I forget sometimes that she isn't here." Something moved across Claire's face too fast for most people to catch. But I had spent a career reading faces across a courtroom, and what I saw in that half second before the sympathy replaced, it was not sorrow, it was relief. "Come on," she said, setting down her bag. "Let me make you some lunch." I watched her move to the refrigerator and told myself to remember the feeling of that moment, the calm surface and the wreckage underneath, because I was going to need to sustain it for a very long time. 40 seconds. That was how long I had between the sound of Claire's key in the front door lock and the moment she stepped into the kitchen doorway. 40 seconds to bury a video, a dead woman's letter, and 25 years of a love I was no longer certain had ever been returned. I had cross-examined federal prosecutors with less preparation time. I had delivered verdicts that changed lives in less than 40 seconds. But nothing in a lifetime on the bench had required what that moment required to look at the person who had destroyed my family and make her believe completely and without question that I still had no idea. I set my coffee cup down with both hands wrapped around it like a man who needed the warmth. I let my shoulders drop. I softened my eyes the way Eleanor used to say, made me look like I was thinking about something far away. By the time Claire pushed open the kitchen door, I was already someone else. Dad? She stopped in the doorway, coat still on, reading my face the way she had been reading it for months. You're still in the kitchen. I made fresh coffee, I said. You want some? I can never remember if you take cream. Something satisfied moved behind her eyes, quick, almost invisible, but I caught it. You always remember I take cream, Dad. Do I? I looked down at my cup. I suppose I do. She came to the counter and poured herself a mug, moving through my kitchen, with the ease of someone who had long ago decided it was also hers. She kept her coat on. That told me she had not planned to stay long. She had come for a specific purpose and intended to leave once it was accomplished. I wanted to check on you, she said, settling onto the stool across from me at the island. You seemed tired this morning. I'm always tired in October, I said. The cold gets into my knee. I know. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me with an expression so perfectly calibrated to warmth and concern that it might have fooled anyone who had not just watched her walk away from a woman at the bottom of a staircase. Dad, I want to talk to you about the appointment with Dr. Harmon next week. Daniel and I think it would be a good idea if we came with you. That's not necessary, I said. We want to, she said, and her voice had that soft, immovable quality that Eleanor used to call her courthouse voice, the tone Claire used when a discussion had already been decided in her mind, and the other person simply had not been informed yet. It helps to have family present. The doctor can explain things more clearly when someone else is there to listen. I turned my coffee cup in slow circles on the counter. Whatever you think is best, I said. The relief that crossed her face was so genuine, it made my chest ache with a grief I could not afford to show. She reached across the island and covered my hand with hers. Her fingers were cool. Her grip was firm. We're going to take good care of you, she said. That's all Daniel and I want, to make sure you're looked after. You're a good girl, I said, and I held her gaze and smiled the smile of a man who meant it, and every word of it was a lie. And every word of it was also somewhere underneath everything the saddest truth I had ever spoken. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing. The weather, a neighbor's new fence, a news story she had seen on her phone that morning. I answered questions slightly slower than usual. I asked her twice what day the doctor's appointment was, writing it down both times on the notepad by the refrigerator, with the exaggerated care of a man who no longer trusted his own memory. Claire watched each repetition with the focused attention of someone collecting evidence, which I understood now was exactly what she was doing. When she stood to leave, she picked up her bag from the counter stool and began checking her phone. Standard. She checked her phone the way most people her age breathe automatically and without awareness, but this time, she tilted the screen away from me as she read something, and the small unconscious shift of her wrist told me the message had caused a reaction she did not want observed. She was almost to the doorway when her phone buzzed again. She paused with her back to me reading. I watched the tension move across her shoulder blades beneath her coat, a tightening, a held breath. She typed something quickly. She put the phone in her pocket. She turned back to me with a smile that had been assembled in under 3 seconds. I'll see you for dinner, she said. Don't forget to eat lunch. I won't forget, I said. She left. The front door closed. I sat without moving for a count of 10, the way I had learned in my first year on the bench, to wait after a witness left the stand before writing anything down, because the impulse to immediately react was where mistakes were made. Then I stood up, walked to the kitchen doorway, and looked at the counter where Claire's phone had rested while she poured her coffee. She had set it face up for approximately 4 minutes before picking it up again. The screen had lit twice during that time. I had seen the notification bar from across the island, seen it, and filed it away with the same practiced neutrality I applied to crime scene photographs. The sender's name had been abbreviated in the notification, 2 letters and a period. D.H. Daniel Hargrove. The message had been 3 words. I had read them clearly from 8 feet away because 35 years of reading evidence across a courtroom had given me eyesight trained for exactly this kind of distance. 3 words that made the marrow of my bones go cold. Did he get it? Not a question. No question mark. The flat-clipped grammar of someone who communicated in code with someone who already understood the context. Did he get it, the package, the USB Dorothy's letter? They had known something was coming. They had been waiting to find out if it had arrived. I walked back to my reading chair and sat down heavily, my knee throbbing with the particular viciousness it reserved for days when my body understood something my mind was still catching up to. My hands, I noticed with distant surprise, had begun to shake, not the fine tremor of age, but the deep structural tremor of a man whose world had just revealed a second floor he had not known existed. Daniel Hargrove knew about the package, which meant Daniel Hargrove knew what was on the USB, which meant the man who slept in the guest room of my house, who sat at my dinner table and shook my hand at Christmas, was not simply Claire's husband. He was part of whatever this was. He had been part of it from the beginning. Ray. I said to myself in the voice I used when I needed to hear my own name out loud to stay anchored to the present moment. Think, don't feel, think. I pressed both palms flat against my thighs to stop the shaking. I breathed through my nose. Outside the window, the October light had shifted to afternoon gold, and Eleanor's oak trees threw long shadows across the lawn, and the house was so quiet I could hear the kitchen clock ticking from 2 rooms away. I had a video, I had a letter, I had a dead woman's wedding ring sitting in an envelope I hadn't yet opened. And now I knew that the threat inside my own walls was not 1 person, but 2 coordinated, watchful, and already moving. Tonight I decided I would find out exactly how deep Daniel Hargrove's involvement went, and I would do it without leaving this chair. Dinner that evening was the finest performance of my life, and I say that as a man who once delivered a 2-hour closing argument with a broken rib. Daniel Hargrove made pasta. Claire opened a bottle of Chianti and set the table with the good napkins, the linen ones Eleanor had bought at a market in Charlottesville the summer before she died. Watching them move around my kitchen together, easy, coordinated, domestic, I felt something cold and precise settle into the center of my chest. Not hatred, something older and more disciplined than hatred. Recognition. Daniel was 40 minutes late coming home. He offered no explanation beyond traffic on the Beltway, which was plausible enough, and also the kind of detail a man offers when he has been doing something he does not wish to account for. He shook my hand at the doorway, firm, warm, the handshake of a man who had learned early that handshakes were a form of argument, and asked how my day had been. Quiet, I said. My days are all quiet now. He smiled at that. Daniel Hargrove had a smile that arrived exactly on cue every time, with the unfailing reliability of a piece of well-maintained machinery. That sounds like a good thing to me, he said. Some days, I said. We ate. I laughed at Daniel's story about a colleague at the firm who had backed his car into the managing partner's reserved parking space. I complimented Claire's garlic bread. I asked what time the game was on Thursday with the focused uncertainty of a man who had begun to lose track of his weekly schedule. Daniel told me 7 o'clock. I nodded and said I would try to stay awake for it. He laughed again, that same precise laugh, and refilled my wine glass without being asked. I did not touch the wine. When dinner was finished, I told them I was tired and going to bed early. Claire touched my arm as I stood from the table and said she would check on me in the morning. Daniel told me to sleep well. I thanked them both and walked down the hall and closed my bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 3 minutes, listening to the sounds of them cleaning the kitchen, water running cabinet doors, the low murmur of a conversation held deliberately below carrying distance. Then I got up, opened my bedroom door with the care of a man accustomed to moving quietly through a house at night, and walked to my study. The filing cabinet in the corner was where I kept everything that mattered: tax records, property documents, Eleanor's estate papers, 40 years of accumulated financial life. I had not opened it in months. Grief has a way of making paperwork feel obscene. I unlocked it with the small brass key I kept on my watch chain and began pulling folders. The first thing that struck me was the weight of the financial records. I had always maintained clean, organized files. Eleanor had insisted on it, but What I pulled out now had been disturbed, not ransacked, nothing so obvious. Just slightly reordered the way files look when someone has replaced them carefully, but not carefully enough. Someone had been in this cabinet. The second thing that struck me was the signatures. In my 40 years of signing legal documents, I had developed a signature as consistent as a fingerprint. The capital R, slightly forward-leaning, the double L, at the end of Caldwell, executed in a single fluid stroke. I recognized it, the way I recognized my own face. And on 4 documents in the folder marked household accounts. 4 authorization forms for subsidiary accounts I had absolutely no memory of opening. The signature was wrong. Close. Someone had studied it carefully, but the R leaned back instead of forward and the double L broke into 2 separate strokes. My hands went cold. I pressed them against the desk to steady them and read each document. 4 accounts, opened over a period of 18 months, beginning in January of 2024. Combined withdrawals totaling $237,000, moved in increments small enough $3,000 to $8,000 per transaction to avoid triggering automatic bank fraud alerts. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, financial institutions are required to report single transactions exceeding $10,000 to the federal government. Whoever had designed this withdrawal pattern knew that law and had designed specifically around it. This was not amateur work. I set the folders aside and opened the bottom drawer. Under the hanging files beneath a manila envelope containing Eleanor's original will, I found a legal-sized document I did not recognize. The cover page read, "Petition for appointment of guardian and conservator in the matter of Raymond Allen Caldwell." My own name, filed as a legal matter regarding my own capacity to manage my own affairs. I spread the document on the desk and read it the way I had read thousands of petitions in my career from the beginning, word by word, without skimming, without allowing my reaction to interfere with my comprehension. In Virginia, a guardianship petition requires evidence that the subject lacks the capacity to make responsible decisions regarding their personal care or financial affairs. The petition before me cited 3 categories of evidence: A, physician's report witness statements from family members and documented incidents of cognitive confusion. The physician's report carried the name of a Dr. William Fenner practice address listed as Falls Church, Virginia. I had never been to Falls Church. I had never seen a Dr. Fenner. The report detailed 2 consultations I had allegedly attended in August and September of this year, described symptoms I did not have, and concluded with a recommendation that I be placed under the care of a court-appointed guardian. The signature at the bottom bore my name as the patient's acknowledging signature. It was the same forged R, the same broken double L. I put the petition down and pressed both fists against the desk surface hard enough that my knuckles went white. My jaw ached with the effort of keeping my breathing controlled. In all my years presiding over criminal matters, I had seen people destroy other people's lives. With forged signatures, had seen it done to elderly men and women. By people they trusted, had presided over the criminal trials that followed. I had sent men to prison for exactly this. And it had been done to me, in my own home, by people eating pasta at my dinner table 40 minutes ago. "All right," I said to the empty room, my voice rougher than I intended. "All right. You want to play it like this?" I reached for the desk lamp and angled it toward the document. Then I picked up my phone, not the phone Claire knew about, the other one, the prepaid I had bought at a drugstore 3 years ago, when a former defendant had made threats I took seriously enough to prepare for, and I photographed every page, every account statement, every forged signature, every page of the petition that bore my name as a man no longer capable of managing his own life. When I finished, I sat back in the chair and thought about Daniel Hargrove's handshake. Firm, warm, practiced. The handshake of a man making an argument. I thought about the double L at the end of my name broken into 2 strokes by a hand that was not mine. And I thought about Eleanor's face in the hallway footage, the papers pressed against her chest, the fear in her shoulders, and I understood, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had spent his career connecting evidence to motive, exactly what she had found the night she died. She had found this, or something like it. The beginning of it, perhaps the first account statement, the first forged signature, the first indication that someone in our home was dismantling us from the inside. She had tried to confront Claire. She had taken the papers to the top of that staircase, and she had tried to stop it. My eyes burned, not tears, not yet something rawer than tears. the particular pain of understanding that arrives too late. I blinked hard. I set the phone face down on the desk. I said Eleanor's name once quietly in the dark. Then I opened the petition to page 1 and began building my case. I left the house before the sun came up, moving through the dark hallway, with the practiced quiet of a man who had learned decades ago that the best thinking happened before the rest of the world started making noise. The Virginia State Records Archive opened at 8:30. I was in the parking lot at 8:15, sitting with the engine off and the heat still ticking in the dashboard, watching a young woman in a government-issue lanyard unlock the front entrance. I gave her 5 minutes to get settled, then walked in with my retired judge's credentials in my breast pocket and my most authoritative posture assembled around me like a familiar old coat. "Good morning." The woman behind the counter looked up from her computer. Her nameplate read, M. Santos. She was perhaps 30, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the mildly harassed expression of someone who had already answered 3 questions before 9 o'clock. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," I said, and placed 2 documents on the counter, my retired circuit court judge credentials and a signed authorization letter from Frank Doyle, whose federal prosecutor credentials remained active through his consulting work with the U.S. Attorney's Office. "Raymond Caldwell. I'm consulting on a legal matter involving document fraud. My colleague Frank Doyle has authorization from the Eastern District to review sealed family court records connected to this case. This covers the adoption record of Claire Ann Caldwell, finalized March of '97. She examined the credentials with the careful attention of someone who had been trained to look carefully, even when everything appeared legitimate. "Do you have the case number?" "I do." I slid a piece of paper across the counter. "Claire Ann Caldwell adoption, finalized March of '97. The record should be in the closed family court files." She typed for a moment. "I'll need you to sign the access log and wait in reading room B. It may take 20 minutes to pull the physical file." "Of course," I said. "I appreciate your help." It took 18 minutes. I spent them sitting at a long wooden table in a room that smelled of old paper and institutional carpet cleaner, with the specific quality of patience that comes not from calm but from the disciplined suppression of everything that is not calm. My knee hurt. My coffee had gone cold again. I thought about Eleanor and made myself stop. Monsieur Santos brought the file in a manila folder with a checklist clipped to the front. "Please don't remove anything from the folder," she said. "You can photograph pages with your phone if needed. Just log what you photograph on the sheet." "Understood," I said. "Thank you." I opened the folder and began reading from the beginning, the way I had read thousands of documents across a career systematically, without skipping ahead, giving each page its full due before moving to the next. Pages 1 through 6 contained exactly what I expected: the standard Virginia adoption paperwork, court filings, the home study report Eleanor and I had completed, the social worker's assessment. Everything looked clean. Everything looked correct. Then I reached page 7. 35 years of examining legal documents had given me an eye for inconsistency, the way a musician develops an ear for a note that is slightly off pitch. Something about page 7 made the muscles across my shoulders tighten before my conscious mind had identified what it was. I leaned closer. I read the page twice. The content was routine: a certification from the Department of Social Services confirming that the birth parents had been declared deceased, no surviving relatives identified, child cleared for adoption proceedings. Standard language. Correct formatting. But the ink was wrong. In 1997, government documents in Virginia were produced on IBM typewriters or early dot matrix printers that left a characteristic impression in the paper, a slight indentation visible when you held the page at an angle to the light. I tilted page 7 toward the overhead fluorescent. The surface was flat, no indentation. The text had been produced by a laser printer. Laser printing in government offices did not become standard in Virginia until 2003-2004 at the earliest. Someone had replaced the original page 7 with a fabricated document produced years after the adoption was finalized, inserted into the sealed file, and sealed again. My heart knocked hard against my ribs. I pressed my thumbnail against the edge of the page to keep my hand from shaking and photographed it from 3 angles, logging each photograph on the sheet the way M. Santos had instructed. Then I went back to the beginning and read every page again, this time looking specifically for the paper stock, because a substituted page would also show different aging characteristics than the surrounding documents. Page 7 was whiter. marginally almost imperceptibly, but whiter, less yellowed at the edges than pages 6 and 8, which had sat in this folder for 28 years. "Excuse me." I walked back to the counter. Monsieur Santos looked up. "Is there a notary stamp log for this file? A record of when the public notary seal was applied to each page?" She frowned slightly. "Notary logs for family court adoptions are kept separately. I'd have to request that from archive storage. It could take a few days." "I'd appreciate that very much," I said, and gave her my contact information, the secondary email address Claire did not know about. "It's important." Back at the table, I read the birth parent certification one more time. The names listed were Thomas and Margaret Ellison, deceased, 1995, no surviving family. I wrote the names on the back of my parking receipt and tucked it in my shirt pocket. I drove directly to the public library on King Street. The genealogical database terminals were free, and at 9:45 on a Tuesday morning, completely unoccupied. I sat down and searched the Social Security Death Index for Thomas Ellison and Margaret Ellison. Virginia deceased between 1993 and 1997. No results. I broadened the search to the full national database. Still nothing. I tried the Virginia Vital Records Index, the State Death Certificate Registry, the National Death Index maintained by the CDC. Thomas and Margaret Ellison did not appear to have died in 1995. As far as every federal and state database I could access could determine Thomas and Margaret Ellison had not died at all. The library was quiet around me, someone coughing 2 rows over the soft percussion of keyboards, a child asking a librarian something about dinosaurs. Ordinary Tuesday morning sounds. I sat with my hands flat on the table beside the keyboard and felt the shape of what I was learning settle into place with the terrible precision of a verdict that has only ever been going in one direction. Claire's birth parents were not dead. The document certifying their deaths was a fabrication inserted into a sealed court file by someone with access resources and a very specific reason to make a 5-year-old girl appear to have no living family. Someone had manufactured an orphan. I pulled up a legal directory next and searched the name of the attorney listed as representing the parents' interests in the adoption proceeding, Harold Voss, practicing family law in Alexandria. I typed his name into the Virginia State Bar disciplinary records. Harold Voss had been suspended from practice in 2001 for ethical violations related to document fraud in civil proceedings. Prior to that suspension, his client list had included 4 individuals convicted of financial crimes in federal court between 1988 and 1996. My chest felt like something inside it had been pulled too tight to breathe around. I recognized Harold Voss's name, not from the adoption file, from somewhere older, somewhere darker. I sat in that library chair with the fluorescent light humming above me and reached back through 35 years of cases, and the memory surfaced the way memories do when they have been waiting sudden and complete and cold as groundwater. Harold Voss had represented a defendant in my courtroom. Once. Only once, because the defendant had been convicted and sentenced and led away, and Voss had never appeared before me again. The defendant's name rose in my memory like something breaking the surface of deep water. And when it broke, my hands stopped being still. I drove home on back roads I hadn't used in years, moving through the October countryside at 20 miles below the speed limit with the window cracked and the cold air working on my face. Eleanor used to tease me about this habit, the slow drive home when something was forming in my mind. She called it my jury deliberation mode. She said she always knew a big verdict was coming because I would take 45 minutes to drive a road that normally took 15. The name in my memory was Victor Ashford, and the moment it surfaced fully not as a partial impression, but as a complete fact, with a face and a voice and a courtroom attached to it. My foot went to the brake of its own accord, and I sat for a full minute on the shoulder of Route 7, with the engine idling and the red and gold leaves coming down around the car like something from a painting of a world that did not yet know what I knew. Victor Ashford, tried and convicted in my court, October 1993. Wire fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering charges under the federal RICO statute. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the law designed to prosecute criminal enterprises that operate through otherwise legitimate business structures. Ashford had run a network of financial fraud and illegal gambling operations across 3 states, laundering money through a chain of real estate holdings that looked on paper exactly like a successful property investment firm. He had stolen from pension funds. He had stolen from small businesses. He had stolen from people who trusted him. I had sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, and on the day I delivered that sentence, he had looked at me across the courtroom with eyes like something very old and very cold and said, "You took 15 years from me, Raymond. I will take the rest of yours." My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Not fine tremors this time, a deep structural shaking that started in my forearms and moved upward. I pressed my palms flat against the wheel and breathed through it. Then I put the car in drive and finished the remaining 6 miles home. Claire's car was gone from the driveway. I had perhaps 2 hours. The basement stairs creaked on the 4th step, the way they always had, the way Eleanor had always meant to fix, and never did. I moved past boxes of Christmas decorations and winter coats, and the 3 boxes of Eleanor's books I had never been able to donate, and I found the section of metal shelving at the back where I kept the archive boxes from my years on the bench. 12 gray boxes labeled by year, sealed with the combination locks I had installed after the defendant's threats in 2008. 1993. I lifted the box down and carried it to the workbench. Inside, beneath the case files for 7 other trials that year, I found the Ashford folder. It was thicker than I remembered, 4 inches of paper rubber banded in 3 sections. I pulled off the bands and spread the contents across the workbench and turned on the work lamp and began to read. The financial fraud documentation was familiar. I had studied it for months before the trial. What I went to immediately was the personal background section, the defendant profile prepared by the federal prosecutor's office. Victor Ashford. Born 1955, Richmond, Virginia. Prior arrests 2, no convictions. Business holdings listed across Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. Personal assets at time of arrest estimated at $11 million. Family status. I found it at the bottom of the 3rd page. Married, divorced. 1 child. Daughter. Born 1992. Name, Victoria Ashford. I picked up my phone with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else and opened the photograph I had taken in the library, the page from the adoption file, showing Claire's birth parent information. I placed the phone beside the defendant profile and looked at both documents under the work lamp. The dates aligned perfectly. Victoria Ashford, born 1992. Claire's adoption, finalized March 1997. 4 years after Victor's conviction, 3 years after Victor would have entered federal prison and understood that his daughter needed to disappear into a system he could later access. I straightened up from the workbench and put both hands on the edge of it to hold myself steady because my legs had decided they were no longer entirely reliable. Say it out loud. I told myself the way I used to tell law clerks to verbalize their reasoning when they were afraid of their own conclusions. Say what you know. "Claire is Victor Ashford's daughter," I said to the basement. My voice came out wrecked, torn up from somewhere below my chest. "He put her in the adoption system to get her into my family. He has been planning this for 30 years. The words hung in the cold basement air. I let them stay there. I needed to hear them exist outside of my own skull before I could believe they were real. I went back to the file. The prosecutor's notes included interview transcripts from Victor's associates' men who had worked in his organization and agreed to cooperate with the federal investigation in exchange for reduced sentences. I found the name Harold Voss in 2 of those transcripts listed as legal counsel who had coordinated document preparation for several of the fraudulent real estate transactions. Voss had not been charged. Insufficient evidence, the notes said. He had been careful. He had remained careful enough, apparently, to continue being useful to Victor Ashford for another decade. And then I found the last page of the personal background section, a supplementary note added by the prosecutor in handwriting I recognized as belonging to Frank Doyle, my friend who had been the lead federal prosecutor on the Ashford case before I had been assigned to preside. Frank's handwriting in the margin, dated 2 weeks after sentencing, defendant made direct statement to Judge Caldwell in open court. Consider increased threat assessment. Recommend continued monitoring. The monitoring had apparently not extended to a man who spent 15 years in a federal correctional facility, engineering the placement of his own daughter into the household of the judge who had sentenced him. I stood at that workbench for a long time. The basement was cold and smelled of cardboard and machine oil and the particular stillness of stored years. Above me, the house was empty and quiet in the way that houses are quiet when the people living in them have been lying to you for longer than you realized. Then I found the letter. It was tucked into the back of the folder, behind the sentencing documentation, inside a plain white envelope with no address and no stamp. Eleanor's handwriting on the front. My name. Just Ray. My hands shook so badly opening that envelope that I tore the corner. Inside was a single sheet of her personal stationery, the cream paper with the small blue E in the corner that her sister had given her years ago. The letter said, Ray. I found something in Claire's room today, a photograph I cannot explain. A man in a prison uniform. Claire is standing beside him. She looks maybe 20. On the back it says, My darling girl, I will come back for you. I don't know what this means. I'm scared to ask her directly. I think we need to talk to someone who can help us understand what we're looking at. I'm going to show you tonight. I love you. Don't be angry. Just help me understand. E. The date at the top of the letter was October 14th, 2020, the day she died. I folded the letter back along its original creases and pressed it between both palms and held it there against my sternum and breathed in the cold basement air until the burning in my eyes subsided enough that I could see clearly. Eleanor had found the photograph. Eleanor had written me a letter. Eleanor had planned to show me that evening what she had found, and she had not lived to do it because Claire had found out first. My wife had died trying to protect me from the truth I was holding in my hands. I hear you, Ellie, I said, and my voice broke completely on her name, and I let it break just that once, just in the basement where no one could hear. I hear you. I'm so sorry it took me this long. I put the letter in my breast pocket. I put the Ashford folder under my arm, and I went upstairs to make a phone call I should have made 30 years ago. Before I tell you what I decided to do next, and trust me, what came next changed everything I need to know if you are still with me. If you have been listening to this family story and your heart is as heavy as mine was in that basement drop, the number 72 in the comments right now. 72 my age, the year I finally understood how blind I had been. Let me see your number down there. And one more thing before we continue, parts of what you are about to hear are drawn from real experience but shaped into story form for this telling. If that is not something you wish to hear, this is a good moment to step away. But if you are staying, hold on, because it is about to get much harder before it gets better. 7 days. I spent 7 days becoming someone I had never been, and hoped to God I would never actually become a man whose mind was leaving him grain by grain, like sand through a fist that could no longer close properly. I forgot where I put my reading glasses, even when they were on my face. I asked Claire what day it was on 3 consecutive mornings, writing her answer each time in the notepad by the refrigerator, with the labored concentration of a student copying from a blackboard. I watched television programs I had never chosen for myself, and let them wash over me with the blank receptivity of a man for whom 1 hour was becoming indistinguishable from the next. It was exhausting. Not the performance came more naturally than I wanted to admit. What exhausted me was the discipline of never dropping it. Not for a second. Not when Daniel said something at dinner that made the muscles in my jaw want to tighten. Not when Claire adjusted the thermostat without asking, because she explained to Daniel in a voice she thought I couldn't hear. Dad gets confused when it's cold. Not when I watched her photograph the notepad beside the refrigerator, with her phone page by page building her evidence file, while I pretended to be absorbed in a nature documentary about migratory birds. The doctor's appointment came on the 5th day. Dr. Gerald Webb had been our family physician for 11 years, a quiet, thorough man in his late 50s, who had delivered news of Eleanor's first cardiac diagnosis with the careful seriousness of someone who understood that information was a form of medicine. I had always respected him. Walking into his office with Claire beside me, knowing what I was about to do, I felt something uncomfortably close to shame. Raymond, Dr. Webb shook my hand across his desk. Good to see you. Claire tells me you've been having some trouble with your memory lately. I turned to Claire with the slightly lost expression I had been practicing in the bathroom mirror each morning. Have I been? I asked. I didn't know you'd called ahead. Claire touched my arm. I mentioned it when I made the appointment, Dad. Remember? Of course, I said, in the voice of a man who did not remember at all. Dr. Webb asked me a standard series of orientation questions. The date, the current president, and the name of the street I lived on. I answered the first 2 correctly and hesitated on the third, long enough that Webb made a small note on his pad. He asked me to count backward from 100 by 7s. I got to 72 before I stopped and said I had lost the thread. He nodded and wrote something else. Raymond, he said, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk, Are you sleeping well? Not always, I said. That part was true. Any confusion when you wake up? Difficulty recognizing where you are? Sometimes the house feels large, I said. Like rooms I know very well have gotten farther apart. Webb glanced at Claire. She was nodding, her hands folded in her lap, performing her own version of a concerned daughter, with a fluency that would have impressed me if it had not made my heart feel like something being slowly squeezed dry. I'm going to note some mild cognitive changes consistent with early-stage age-related decline, Webb said carefully. Nothing alarming, but worth monitoring. I'd like to see you again in 6 weeks. Whatever you think is best, I said. In the car on the way home, Claire called Daniel. I sat in the passenger seat with my head tipped slightly toward the window, the way a tired old man sits, and I listened to every word she said. It went well, she told him, her voice carrying the particular low energy of relief after long tension. Webb documented it. He used the words cognitive changes in his notes. That's enough for the next filing. A pause. No, he was fine. He's further along than I thought, actually. Another pause, shorter. I know, Daniel. Just have Graham update the petition language. We're on schedule. She ended the call. She looked over at me. I was watching a gas station pass by outside the window with the unfocused attention of a man whose thoughts had drifted somewhere mild and unreachable. Almost home, Dad, she said softly. Good, I said. I'd like some tea. That night I waited until the house had been quiet for 2 hours. Then I went to the garden. October had stripped Eleanor's rose bushes down to their canes, and the yard smelled of cold earth and dead leaves, the smell of things that were dormant rather than finished, waiting under the surface for a season that had not yet arrived. I stood beside the roses and looked up at a sky thick with clouds that hid every star. I'm going to need help. Ellie, I said quietly to the roses. The kind of help you always told me I was too proud to ask for. I took the prepaid phone from the pocket of my robe. I had composed the message in my head over the course of the previous 3 days, revising it, the way I used to revise written verdicts, cutting everything that was not essential, keeping only what the moment required. I typed Frank. It's Ray Caldwell. I need your help, not as a judge, as a father. I pressed send. I stood in the garden for another few minutes, listening to the October wind moose through the bare canes of Eleanor's rose bushes with a dry, papery sound like pages turning in an empty room. The phone buzzed in my hand 40 seconds later. Frank Doyle. One line. Name, the time, and place. I'll be there. My eyes went hot, and I pressed the back of my wrist against them hard because 72 years old, or not, a man is allowed exactly 1 moment of raw relief before he has to get back to work. I buried the phone beneath the largest rose cane in the hollow, where the root met the soil, the way Eleanor used to hide the spare house key in the loose brick by the back steps. Thank you, I told her, and went back inside. I told Claire I was going to the pharmacy. Instead, I drove 40 minutes south on Route 1 to a diner called Keating's that Frank Doyle and I had been visiting since 1991, back when we were both young enough to eat the country breakfast without thinking about our cholesterol, and arrogant enough to believe that the justice system would always reward the right people if you worked hard enough inside it. The booths were the same dark green vinyl. The coffee was the same industrial strength. The pie under the glass dome on the counter looked like it had achieved a kind of geological permanence. Frank was already there when I arrived, sitting in the back booth with his coat still on and 2 cups of coffee in front of him. He was 68 years old and had lost the last of his hair since I'd last seen him, but he still held himself the way a federal prosecutor holds himself, spine straight, chin-level eyes that moved around a room with the continuous low-level assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating everyone in it for what they might be concealing. He stood when he saw me coming. His hand came out. Ray. His voice was exactly as I remembered, deep, deliberate, the voice of a man who had spent decades ensuring that juries understood every syllable. You look like you haven't slept in a week. Closer to 3, I said, and slid into the booth across from him. He sat. He looked at me with the complete, unhurried attention he had once directed at hostile witnesses, and he said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning. Don't edit." So I did. I told him about Dorothy's package, about the video, about the forged signatures and the guardianship petition, and the $237,000 moved in careful increments below the Bank Secrecy Act threshold. I told him about the adoption file and page 7 and the laser printer ink that had not existed in 1997. I told him about Harold Voss. I told him about Eleanor's letter dated the day she died. And then I told him the name. Frank's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it back down with a precision that reminded me of a man carefully placing a piece of evidence on a table. His jaw tightened. A muscle moved along his cheekbone. "Victor Ashford," he said. "Victor Ashford," I confirmed. Frank exhaled through his nose, long, and controlled the breath of a man who has just had a suspicion of many years confirmed. "Ray," he said, "I have been waiting for that name to surface for a very long time." My chest went tight. "You knew—" "Not this." He shook his head, his expression hard and careful at once. "Not Claire, not the adoption." But Victor Ashford did not disappear after Allenwood. We had intelligence suggesting he rebuilt his financial network within 2 years of release shell companies, real estate holding groups, all of it clean on paper and dirty underneath. I flagged it to the Bureau in 2010. He paused. They opened a file. They've been building it slowly ever since. But Ray, they never had the thread that connected everything. They had the organization, but not the motive. They had the money, but not the target. "I'm the target," I said. "You were always the target." Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to the register he used when what he was saying needed to be heard precisely. "The day you sentenced him, you didn't just take 15 years. You took everything Victor Ashford believed he was. His power, his reputation, his freedom. Men like Victor, men who have built their entire identity around being untouchable, they don't recover from that kind of humiliation. They reconstruct around it. They make the humiliation into the architecture of everything they do next." I looked at my coffee. The surface of it was still. "He put his daughter in my house," I said. "He waited 25 years. He's patient," Frank said. "That's what makes him more dangerous now than he was in '93. He picked up at his coffee and drank. "And Ray, you're not the first." I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Frank's expression shifted, something between professional caution and genuine discomfort moving across his face. 15 years ago, Victor attempted something similar with a former federal appeals court judge in Maryland, Judge Harriet Connolly. He placed an associate's nephew into her household as a caregiver after her husband died. The plan failed because the nephew got cold feet and confessed to Connolly before it went anywhere. Frank set his cup down. Connolly reported it. The Bureau investigated. Victor was never directly connected, too many layers between him and the nephew. The file went cold. He looked at me steadily. "You are attempt number 2, and he has had 15 years to correct whatever went wrong the first time." The diner around us continued its ordinary Tuesday morning business. A waitress refilling someone's water glass, 2 booths over the cook calling out an order number, a couple near the window arguing pleasantly about directions. I sat in the middle of all that ordinary life and felt the full weight of what Frank had just told me pressed down through my sternum like a physical thing. "He chose Claire because she was blood," I said. "Because blood wouldn't get cold feet. Blood and 30 years of very careful cultivation," Frank said grimly. "Ray, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." He waited until I nodded. "Do you want to bring him down, or do you want to survive this?" "Both," I said immediately. Frank almost smiled. "Good. Because to do both, we need help. You can't provide yourself." He reached into his coat pocket and took out a business card, plain white with a government seal embossed in the corner. He slid it across the table. "Special Agent Sarah Nolan, Financial Crimes, FBI, Richmond Field Office. She's been the case agent on the Ashford file for 4 years. She is, in my considered opinion, the sharpest investigator I have worked with in 40 years of federal law." I picked up the card. "She knows about me. She knows Victor has a target. She doesn't know it's you. Not yet." Frank leaned back and folded his arms with the satisfied deliberateness of a man who has just placed a key piece on a chessboard. "But Ray, to bring Victor down in a way that sticks, we need more than what you have. We need him on record, his voice, his confession. A document trail is circumstantial. A man saying what he did and why he did it, that is a conviction. And to get that," I said slowly, "I need him to believe he's already won." Frank pointed at me across the coffee cups. "There it is. That's the verdict." I looked at the business card in my hand. Sarah Nolan, FBI. 4 years building a file on the man who had spent 30 years building a case against me. Something occurred to me, that I had not considered before, that Victor Ashford and I had been moving toward each other through time for 3 decades, both of us building, both of us patient, neither of us knowing that the other had not yet made the decisive move. "Frank," I said, "tell me about Sarah Nolan." He leaned forward, and for the next 20 minutes in that green vinyl booth in a diner on Route 1, the former federal prosecutor and the retired circuit court judge began the work of dismantling 30 years of a very patient man's revenge. Frank tracked Dorothy Pierce down in 3 days. He called me on a Tuesday morning while I was sitting at the kitchen table pretending to struggle with the crossword puzzle, another prop in the performance Claire had come to expect. And his voice on the line was quiet and careful in the way it got, when he had information that needed to be delivered without the person receiving it falling apart before he finished delivering it. "She's at Mercy House," he said. "Hospice facility on the west side of Alexandria, room 14. She's been in there 6 weeks. A pause. "Ray, she doesn't have much time. If you're going to go, it needs to be soon." I put the crossword pen down. My hand was steady. "Does she know I'm coming?" "I told her you might," she said. Frank stopped, cleared his throat. "She said she's been praying you would." I went the following afternoon, telling Claire I had a lunch with a former law clerk. I drove to Alexandria through a November sky the color of old pewter, the kind of flat, lightless gray that settles over Virginia in the weeks before winter commits to itself. Mercy House was a low brick building, set back from the road behind a row of bare maples, with a small garden visible through the lobby windows, where someone had planted late-season mums that were holding on against the cold, with the stubborn determination of things that did not know they were supposed to have given up by now. The woman at the front desk directed me to room 14 without asking my name. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and something floral underneath it. Someone's attempt, I thought, to make a corridor that people walked into, but did not always walk back out of smell, like a place where ordinary life still had purchase. I knocked on the open door of room 14. Dorothy Pierce had been a large woman when she worked for us, broad-shouldered, capable-handed, the kind of presence that made a kitchen feel properly occupied. What lay in the bed before me had been reduced by illness to something that seemed too small for the person I remembered. Her hair had gone completely white. Her hands on the blanket were the hands of a woman in serious pain knuckles, swollen fingers curled slightly inward, the particular stillness of someone who had learned that movement cost more than it was usually worth. But her eyes, when she opened them and found me in the doorway, were exactly as I remembered. Dark brown, direct, carrying the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent their lives noticing things that other people overlook. "Your Honor?" Her voice came out rough and thin like paper that had been folded too many times. She tried to push herself upright against the pillow and winced with the effort. "Don't," I said, moving quickly to the chair beside the bed. "Please, stay where you are." I sat and leaned forward and took one of her damaged hands in both of mine. It was cool and very light. "Dorothy, I'm glad you're still here." Her eyes filled immediately, not slowly, the way tears sometimes gather, but all at once as if the sight of me had released something that had been held back under enormous pressure for a very long time. "I am so sorry," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her lips together hard to keep control of it. "I am so deeply, deeply sorry, Raymond. I have asked God to forgive me every single day for 5 years, and I still don't know if I deserve it. Dorothy," I tightened my hands around hers, "I'm not here to judge you. I have spent my life judging people, and I am finished with it for today. I am here because I need to understand what happened. That's all." She nodded, breathing carefully through the pain of whatever was happening inside her chest. Then she began to talk. She told me about Eleanor's behavior in the weeks before she died, the way Eleanor had become quieter, more watchful, going through the house at odd hours, looking at things that had always been there, as if seeing them for the first time. She told me about the afternoon she found Eleanor in Claire's room, sitting on the bed with a photograph in her hands, face drained of color. "She showed it to me," Dorothy said. "The photograph, a man in prison clothes, Claire standing next to him. Claire was maybe 19-20. She was smiling." Dorothy's voice dropped. "Mrs. Eleanor asked me if I had ever seen that man before. I told her I hadn't. She said she didn't know who he was, but that something about the photograph frightened her." Dorothy's eyes moved to the window, to the bare maples outside. She said it frightened her the way that things frighten you when you understand them, without being able to explain exactly why. "What did you tell her to do?" I asked. My throat was tight, but my voice came out even. I told her to talk to you, Dorothy said, and fresh tears spilled down the sides of her face onto the pillow. I told her that same evening, Mrs. Eleanor, you need to show this to Raymond tonight. She said she would. She said she had already written you a note in case she lost her nerve. Dorothy's hand trembled in mine. She never lost her nerve. She never got the chance. She described the night of October 14th, the argument she heard from the kitchen, the way she had climbed the back stairs and looked through the slats of the landing railing and seen what she saw. She described it without embellishment, in the flat, factual cadence of someone who had rehearsed the account so many times in their own memory that the emotion had been worn down to the shape of pure event. But when she reached the moment Eleanor fell, her breath caught so hard that her whole body convulsed with it, and I gripped her hand and told her to breathe. Just breathe. Take her time. She came to my room 3 days later, Dorothy said when she had steadied herself. Claire did. She put an envelope on my dresser. She told me what was in it. She told me that if I ever said a word to anyone, she would make sure I had no income, no reference, nowhere to go. Dorothy's jaw set with the ghost of the stubbornness I remembered in her. I was 65 years old. I had no family left. I took the money, and I have hated myself every morning since I woke up and every night before I could sleep. Dorothy, I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped against something inside my chest that had been scraped too many times already. You sent me the package. You sent me everything. That took more courage than most people will ever need. She reached under her pillow with her free hand, slowly, painfully, and brought out a small envelope. She held it toward me, and her hand shook so badly that I reached out quickly to take it before she dropped it. Mrs. Eleanor gave me that, she said. The night before she died, she came to my room after dinner, and she said, Dorothy, I want you to keep this somewhere safe, in case anything ever happens. She didn't say what she meant by that. I think she was more afraid than she was letting on. Dorothy's voice broke completely. I think she knew something might happen. I think she was trying to protect you even then. I opened the envelope. Inside was Eleanor's wedding ring, the simple gold band I had placed on her finger in June of 1978 in a church in Charlottesville with 40 people watching and my hands shaking worse than they were shaking now. And beneath the ring was a folded piece of her cream stationery, 4 words in her handwriting, Ray, V-A, find him. The burning in my eyes became something I could not contain. I pressed the ring between my palms and held it there against my heart and breathed through my nose in long, deliberate counts the way the cardiologist had taught me after the episode 3 years ago, and Dorothy Pierce held my wrist with her broken hands. And neither of us said anything for a moment because there was nothing that words could usefully do. Then I looked up at her. You did the right thing, I said. What you did sending the package, finding the courage after 5 years, Eleanor would have understood. I promise you that. Dorothy's face crumpled. She cried with the abandoned, exhausted weeping of someone who has been holding something enormous for too long and has finally, at the very end of everything, been given permission to put it down. I sat beside her and kept hold of her hand until the crying eased into something quieter. When I finally stood to leave, she looked up at me from the pillow with red-rimmed eyes and said, Will you make it right? Raymond for her? I put Eleanor's ring in my breast pocket against my heart. Yes, I said, I will. I walked out of Mercy House into the November cold. The bare maples stood gray and patient along the driveway. I got into my car and sat with both hands on the wheel for a long time before I started the engine. When I finally turned onto the road back toward home, I noticed a dark sedan parked across the street from the Mercy House entrance engine, running windows tinted, sitting in a spot that offered a clear sightline to the facility's front door. It had not been there when I arrived. 20 years on the bench had trained me to notice things that did not belong, and the dark sedan outside Mercy House had not belonged. I drove home on surface streets instead of the highway, checking the rearview mirror at every other block with the methodical attention of a man who had spent the drive from Alexandria deciding that paranoia and reasonable caution were not in the current circumstances meaningfully different from each other. No sedan followed me, but the absence of it was not reassuring. The absence of it meant whoever had been watching knew where I lived and had no need to follow me home. I parked in the garage and sat in the car for a full minute, my hand resting on Eleanor's ring through the fabric of my breast pocket, steadying myself the way I used to steady myself before walking into a courtroom for a case I knew was going to be ugly. Then I went inside. The light in the living room was on. That was wrong. Claire's car was in the driveway, but the living room light was never on at this hour. She worked at the kitchen table in the afternoon and moved to the den after dinner. A living room light meant a guest, and a guest meant something had moved forward without my knowledge. I pushed open the living room door. A man I had never seen before was sitting in the armchair that Eleanor had reupholstered the summer before she died, the wingback by the window that had been in our family for 30 years. He was perhaps 55, silver-haired, wearing a dark charcoal suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was holding a leather portfolio on his knee, with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to arriving in other people's homes and making himself comfortable before they arrived. Claire stood near the fireplace. Daniel was on the sofa. Both of them looked up when I walked in, and the particular quality of their attention alert, coordinated, almost rehearsed, told me this meeting had been prepared for. "Dad?" Claire's voice was warm and steady, the courthouse voice. "This is Mr. Graham. He's an attorney who helps families with estate planning and financial management. He just wanted to introduce himself." Graham stood and extended his hand. His grip was firm and cool and lasted exactly the right number of seconds, the handshake of someone trained to project authority without aggression. "Mr. Caldwell, it's a pleasure. I've heard a great deal about you." "Have you?" I said, not quite making it a question. I shook his hand and settled into the other armchair and arranged myself with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints required negotiation. "I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," Graham said pleasantly, resuming his seat. "I was referred to your family by a mutual acquaintance who thought I might be of service. I specialize in elder care financial planning, helping families ensure that assets are protected and properly managed as circumstances change." I looked at him with the mild, slightly unfocused expression of a man struggling to keep pace with the conversation. "I see," I said. "And what sort of changes are we discussing?" Graham opened his portfolio. He removed a set of documents and placed them on the coffee table between us, turning them to face me with the smooth efficiency of a man who did this several times a week. "These are financial management authorization forms," he said. "What they allow essentially is for your daughter to act on your behalf in financial matters, paying bills, managing accounts, making investment decisions. It's a very common arrangement for families in your situation. In Virginia, a financial power of attorney, or POA, gives the designated agent legal authority to manage the grantor's financial affairs. Unlike a guardianship which requires a court finding of incapacity, a POA can be executed voluntarily at any time. What Graham was presenting me with was a voluntary transfer of financial control that, once signed, would give Claire and Daniel access to every account, every asset, every financial decision in my name. I understood immediately the document they needed me to sign before the guardianship petition went to court, because a voluntary POA looked far less like exploitation than a court-ordered conservatorship. I picked up the documents and held them at the slightly too far distance of a man whose reading glasses were not doing quite enough work. "This is a great deal of paperwork," I said. "It can look that way." Graham said, his voice carrying the particular calibrated patience of a man who's charged $400 an hour for it. "But the substance is straightforward. You're simply authorizing Claire to help manage things. Given what Dr. Webb noted in your file, it really does make things easier for everyone." I felt Daniel shift on the sofa. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the documents and let a small furrow develop between my brows, the furrow of a man working harder than he should have to. "Can I keep these?" I asked. "To read at my own pace." Graham and Claire exchanged a glance that lasted less than a second, the compressed communication of people who had discussed exactly this contingency and reached an agreement about it in advance. "Of course," Graham said. "Take all the time you need." He said it smoothly, but his left hand, I noticed, had moved to the edge of his portfolio, with a grip that was slightly tighter than the rest of his posture suggested. He wanted those documents signed tonight. The offer of time was a performance, not a concession. I set the papers in my lap. I looked at Claire with the grateful, slightly overwhelmed expression of a father who was moved by his daughter's care. "You're very good to me," I said. Claire came and sat on the arm of my chair and put her hand on my shoulder. Her touch was light and warm. "We just want to make sure you're okay, Dad," she said. "That's all any of this is." I nodded and patted her hand and told Graham it was very good of him to come. He left 20 minutes later. Daniel walked him to the door, and I heard their voices low in the hallway for a moment before the front door closed. I stayed in the armchair with the documents in my lap, and Eleanor's ring in my pocket, and the particular inner stillness of a man who is managing by the thinnest margin to keep 30 years of judicial training between himself and the thing he actually felt. Then Daniel came back into the room, and Claire looked up from her phone, and in the brief unguarded moment before they registered that I was watching them, before their faces rearranged themselves into the appropriate expressions, I saw something pass between them. Relief, yes. But underneath the relief, something sharper. Urgency. They were running out of time. Something had changed their schedule. Something was pushing them to move faster than they had planned. I said goodnight and went to my room. I sat on the bed and took the documents out and photographed every page with the prepaid phone. Then I sent the photographs to Frank Doyle with a single line of text. They're accelerating. And then, in the stillness of my bedroom, I heard it. Through the wall, barely audible Claire's voice. One sentence. She said it once, and then dropped to a murmur I could not follow. But that one sentence came through the plaster and the insulation and the 40-year-old bones of this house as clearly as if she had said it in the same room. She said, "Victor wants it done before the 15th. I pressed my back against the headboard and closed my eyes. Eleanor's ring was in my right hand. I held it until the metal warmed to my skin and became indistinguishable from my own pulse. Victor Ashford had just named a deadline, and that deadline was my birthday. Frank called me 2 mornings after Graham's visit while I was in the kitchen, pretending to have a trouble with the coffee maker, a new addition to the performance that Claire had begun documenting with the subtle, persistent attention of a scientist recording behavioral data. Frank's voice on the line was stripped down to essentials, the way it always was when the situation had moved past the stage of careful consideration and into the stage of necessary action. "My house," he said. 3 o'clock, come the back way through Ashland. Don't use the navigation on your regular phone. I told Claire I was going to the pharmacy and then perhaps for a drive. She said that sounded lovely and asked me to be home by 6. The concern in her voice was so perfectly pitched that for one disorienting moment, I almost believed it myself. Frank Doyle's house was a federal-style brick on a quiet street in Richmond's Fan District, the kind of neighborhood where the houses had been old for so long that their age had ceased to be remarkable. I parked 2 blocks away and walked, and when I came through his back gate into the garden, the kitchen door was already open, and Frank was standing in the doorway with his coat still on, as if he had just arrived himself. "She's already inside," he said. "Sarah Nolan. Ray, she's good. Better than good. Let her lead." I followed him through the kitchen into the study, a room lined floor to ceiling, with the accumulated paper of 40 years of federal prosecution, case files, law reviews, bound court transcripts, stacked with the comfortable disorder of a man who knew exactly where everything was. A woman was standing at the center of the room, beside Frank's desk, and she turned when we entered with the unhurried attention of someone who had been using the waiting time productively. Sarah Nolan was perhaps 42, 43, lean and straight-backed, with dark hair pulled away from a face that was all clean angles and steady eyes. She wore no jewelry except a watch. She held a manila folder against her side, the way someone holds something they intend to use. She extended her hand when Frank introduced me, and her grip was firm and brief and entirely without the performative warmth that lawyers and politicians used handshakes to project. "Judge Caldwell," she said. "Frank has told me a great deal. I appreciate you coming." "Please," I said. "Raymond." She nodded once, accepting the correction, and opened the folder on Frank's desk. "I want to show you something before we talk," she said, "because I think it will help you understand the scope of what we're dealing with." She spread several documents across the desk: photographs, financial records, corporate filing summaries. Victor Ashford has been operating under 4 different business identities since his release from Allenwood in 2008. She said, moving her finger across the documents with the brisk precision of a woman who had lived inside this information for years. Ashford Capital Partners registered in Delaware. Meridian Property Holdings registered in Nevada. 2 additional LLCs incorporated in Wyoming under nominee directors, people paid to put their names on paperwork they don't control. She looked up at me. Combined asset value across all 4 entities as of our last assessment 6 months ago is somewhere between $40 and $60 million. My chest tightened. All of it clean on the surface," Sarah said. Underneath, we have strong indicators of continued money laundering wire fraud and what we believe is ongoing extortion of at least 3 former business associates. But indicators are not evidence. She tapped the desk with 2 fingers, a sharp, precise sound. What we have needed for 4 years, is a direct connection between Victor Ashford the person and Victor Ashford the criminal enterprise. Every layer of those LLCs exists specifically to prevent us from establishing that connection. The confession, I said. The confession, she confirmed. Under federal law, a recorded admission by the defendant connecting himself to the criminal conduct made voluntarily without coercion in circumstances where he has no reasonable expectation that the statement won't be used against him is among the strongest forms of evidence available to a prosecutor. She looked at me steadily. If Victor Ashford walks into a room and tells you in his own words what he did and why he did it, we can build a prosecution that no defense attorney in the country can dismantle. Frank pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, his big hands folded on the desk. Tell him the rest, Sarah. Sarah's expression shifted, still controlled, but with something underneath it now that I recognized as the look of a person delivering information they wish they did not have to deliver. Raymond, she said, in the past 72 hours, we've had movement on the Ashford file that concerns us. 2 of the nominee directors for his Wyoming LLCs liquidated significant positions last week. That's not normal portfolio management, that's preparation. Someone is moving money to a position where it can be transferred quickly. She paused. Victor Ashford is preparing for an outcome. Either the outcome he wants or the outcome he wants to be able to disappear from. The room felt colder. He's ready to move the moment Claire has what she needs, I said. That's our assessment, Sarah said, which means your window is closing faster than we anticipated. She folded her arms across the folder. Frank tells me your birthday is December 15th. It is, I said. Claire is planning a dinner. She is. Sarah looked at Frank, then back at me. Raymond, what I'm about to propose is something I would not ask of a civilian without serious reservations. You are 72 years old, and you have already been carrying this alone for over a month under circumstances that would have broken most people. She stopped. The look she gave me then was not pity, it was the look of genuine professional respect, which I found unexpectedly far harder to receive. But I think you already know what we need. I straightened in my chair and felt the full discipline of my years on the bench come back into my spine like something that had never really left. You need Victor Ashford to come to that dinner, I said. You need him in that room on record saying what he did. Yes, Sarah said. And to make that happen, I continued, he needs to believe that dinner is the night everything concludes in his favor. He needs to believe he has already won. Which means, Frank said quietly from his chair, that between now and December 15th, everything has to look exactly the way they expect it to look. I thought about the documents on my kitchen counter. I thought about Graham's leather portfolio. I thought about Claire's hand warm on my shoulder and the courthouse voice she used when a conversation had already been decided. I thought about Eleanor's ring in my breast pocket and the 4 words on the cream stationery. Oh, then let's make sure it does, I said. Sarah opened a second folder and began laying out the operational plan with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had been building toward this conversation for 4 years. Recording equipment, agent placement, legal authorization chain under Title III of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. Federal agents could deploy audio surveillance equipment with a court-issued warrant, and Sarah already had a judge in the Eastern District of Virginia prepared to sign the moment she submitted the application. 2 agents would attend the dinner as catering staff. A third would monitor from a vehicle outside. Everything Victor said inside that house on December 15th would be captured on equipment sensitive enough to pick up a conversation through 2 closed doors. There is one condition, Sarah said when she had finished. She looked at me directly. If at any point during that evening we assess that your physical safety is at risk, we move immediately. We don't wait for a better statement. Your safety is not a variable. My throat went tight in a way I had not expected. It had been a long time since anyone had said something like that to me, and meant it without qualification. Understood, I said. Frank stood and extended his hand. I shook it. Then Sarah Nolan extended hers, and I shook that too, and the 3 of us stood in Frank's paper-lined study in the November afternoon light, with the shape of December 15th laid out between us and the desk, like a verdict waiting to be read. I came home from Frank's house and did something that surprised even me. I walked into the kitchen where Claire was making dinner and told her I wanted my birthday to be special this year. I said it the way the man she thought I was would say it, slowly, with the slightly wistful quality of someone who understood, without quite articulating the understanding that the number of birthdays remaining was finite in a way it had not always seemed to be. Claire looked up from the stove, and her face opened with a warmth so immediate and unguarded that for one terrible second I saw the 5-year-old girl in it, the child Eleanor had carried through our front door on a February evening, small and frightened and clutching a stuffed rabbit that had lost one of its button eyes. I made myself hold her gaze and smile, and the effort of it was the hardest thing I had done in 30 years on any bench. "Of course it will be special, Dad," she said, and she came around the counter and hugged me with both arms and her chin on my shoulder, and she smelled of the same soap she had used since she was a teenager, and I stood in the kitchen of the house Eleanor and I had built together and let my daughter hold me and felt my heart breaking in two completely separate directions at once. "Just family," I said into her shoulder. "I don't want a crowd, just us at home, maybe a nice dinner." She pulled back and looked at me with bright eyes. "I'll make it perfect," she said. "I promise." She kept that promise with a thoroughness that should have touched me and instead confirmed everything I needed to know. Over the following days, she ordered flowers from the florist on King Street. She called the wine merchant on Union for a case of the Burgundy. I had stopped drinking 3 years ago at the cardiologist's recommendation, which told me she intended the evening to involve a great deal of wine being offered to me. She researched menus online at the kitchen table with the focused pleasure of a woman planning something she had been looking forward to for a long time. Daniel, meanwhile, began mentioning the financial documents with the gentle escalating frequency of a man running a campaign. Over breakfast one morning, he said it would be good to get them sorted before the holidays. Over dinner, 2 days later, he said Graham had called to ask if there were any questions. On a Wednesday evening, he sat beside me on the sofa and said with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed it until the seams were invisible, that signing would really take a weight off everyone's shoulders, including mine. "Let me think about it a little longer," I said each time in the slow, uncertain voice of a man who needed more time to process things than he once had. Daniel accepted each repetition with a patience that was costing him something. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened by a fraction before the pleasant expression reasserted itself. Then came the Thursday morning that changed the texture of everything. I was in the kitchen making toast when Claire left the room to answer her phone. Her coat was draped over the counter stool, and her bag was open beside it, and because I was an old man who had forgotten to be careful, I reached past the bag to get the butter from the refrigerator, and my hand brushed the outside pocket, and I felt something small and hard and cylindrical that had no business being in a coat pocket. I did not take it. I did not look inside the pocket. I went back to my toast in my kitchen and the ordinary November morning, and I waited. She left for the office 40 minutes later. I went to her coat. The pocket held a small glass vial, perhaps 2 inches long, sealed with a rubber stopper. The contents were colorless. There was no pharmacy label, no prescription information, no identifying markings of any kind. My hand was steady when I picked it up, and my mind was very cold and very clear in the way that minds become when they have been trained to function in the presence of things that require them not to feel anything until the work is done. I photographed the vial from 4 angles with the prepaid phone. I replaced it exactly as I had found it. I sent the photographs to Sarah Nolan with the message found in Claire's coat pocket this morning. No label, please identify. Then I made myself eat the toast. Sarah's response came 4 hours later. I was in the garden when the phone buzzed, standing among Eleanor's bare rose canes in the cold November air, with my hands in my coat pockets and my breath making small clouds in front of me. I read the message twice. The vial contained a benzodiazepine compound, a class of central nervous system depressants used medically as sedatives. The specific formulation, Sarah wrote, was not commercially available in standard prescription form. It was a compounded preparation custom mixed to a concentration far beyond therapeutic use. Dissolved in a glass of wine, it would produce rapid sedation and temporary anterograde amnesia, meaning the person who consumed it would have no memory of what occurred during the period of effect. I stood in Eleanor's garden and read those words, "no memory of what occurred," and understood with complete terrible clarity what December 15th was meant to be. They would give me the wine. I would sign the documents. I would have no memory of signing them. And by the time the effects wore off, The financial power of attorney would be executed, witnessed, and filed. Legal, irreversible. And I would not be able to prove I had not signed it voluntarily. They thought of everything, I said aloud, to the bare rose canes and the gray November sky and the ghost of the woman who had loved this garden. My voice came out rough and low. Except one thing, I typed back to Sarah, confirmed. Proceed with warrant application. Her reply was immediate, already submitted. Judge signs tomorrow morning. I put the phone back in my pocket. The garden was very quiet. The rose canes moved in the cold wind with a dry, rattling sound, and the last of the November light was turning the sky above the oak trees a deep bruised amber that Eleanor had always said was her favorite color at this time of year. I thought about Daniel at the dinner table, mentioning the documents with his practiced patience. I thought about Claire ordering Burgundy from the merchant on Union wine she knew I wasn't supposed to drink. I thought about a little girl with a one-eyed stuffed rabbit who had come into our home on a February evening and been loved completely and without reservation for 25 years. And I thought about what it meant that all of the love had not been enough to matter. Then I went inside. I had preparations of my own to make, and unlike theirs, mine were going to work. Frank called me on the morning of December 3rd. With the particular flatness in his voice that I had learned over 40 years of friendship, meant he was delivering information he wished he did not have. Victor Ashford has been seen twice in your neighborhood in the past week, he said. Once on foot, once in a car registered to one of the Wyoming LLCs. He's not hiding, Ray. He's watching. And men like Victor don't watch unless they're close to moving. I was standing at the kitchen window when he said it, looking at Eleanor's rose canes in the December frost. My coffee had gone cold in my hand. Has Sarah been notified? She has the surveillance reports, Frank said. She wants you to stay the course. Nothing changes before the 15th. A pause, careful, and waited. But Ray, if he contacts you directly, you call me before you respond to anything. Do you understand me? Of course, I said. I thanked him and ended the call and stood at the window for a long moment, and my reflection in the glass looked back at me with the expression of a man who already suspected that staying the course was about to become considerably more complicated. The message arrived at 9:17 that evening to the prepaid phone. An address on M Street Northwest in Georgetown. A time 10 o'clock. No name, no explanation. Just those two pieces of information delivered with the clean economy of someone who was certain the recipient would understand exactly what they meant and would come. I called Frank immediately. He told me not to go. His voice had an edge in it I had not heard since the Ashford trial 30 years ago. The edge of a man who understood exactly what kind of person sent messages like that. Ray, he said, Victor Ashford does not arrange meetings to negotiate. He arranges them to demonstrate that he controls the terms. If you walk into that bar tonight, you are walking into his theater. I know, I said. Then don't go. Frank, I said quietly, he's going to be at my house in 12 days. I need to look him in the eye before that happens. I need to know what I'm walking into. A long silence on Frank's end, then, take the recorder, the small one Sarah gave you, inside breast pocket, not outside. And Ray, do not let him make you angry, whatever he says. The bar on M Street was called Harrington's Dim Lighting Dark Wood, the kind of place that attracted a certain type of Washington professional who preferred their conversations unobserved. I arrived at 9:55 and stood in the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the low light. Victor Ashford was at a corner table, as far from the entrance as the room permitted. He was 70 years old, and he looked it, but not in the way that most men of 70 looked it. Most men of 70 had been softened by their years, rounded at the edges, slowed in their movements, carrying the pleasant heaviness of lives that had settled into themselves. Victor Ashford had been hardened. 15 years in federal prison and 17 years of patient reconstruction afterward had compressed him into something denser and more deliberate than the man I remembered from my courtroom. His hair was silver white, cut close. He wore a dark navy suit with a pocket square. His hands resting on the table on either side of a glass of scotch were completely still. He watched me cross the room with the expression of a man who had been anticipating this moment for a very long time and intended to enjoy every second of it. I sat down across from him. A waiter appeared, and I ordered water. Victor waited until the waiter had gone, and then he said in a voice that had not changed at all from the one I remembered across 30 feet of courtroom, "You look old, Raymond." "So do you, Victor," I said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Older, yes, but I haven't spent the last month being managed by my own daughter. He picked up his scotch and turned the glass slowly in his fingers. How is Claire, by the way? She tells me you've been very cooperative. The recorder was warm against my ribs. I kept my face entirely neutral and my breathing entirely controlled, and I said, "She's well, she takes good care of me." "She does," Victor said, and the quiet satisfaction in his voice made my jaw ache with the effort of not responding to it. "She's remarkable, actually. She always has been. Even as a child, she had a quality that most people spend their whole lives trying to develop patience. The ability to wait for the right moment." He set the glass down. "I wonder where she got that." "What do you want, Victor?" I said. He leaned back in his chair and regarded me with the unhurried attention of a man who believed time was entirely on his side. "I want to give you an opportunity," he said. "A graceful exit. Sign the documents Claire has prepared. Do it before the dinner quietly without any unpleasantness. And I give you my word that everything that follows will be handled with complete discretion." "Your word," I said. "My word," he confirmed without any indication that he found the phrase ironic. I looked at him across the table, at the still hands and the careful suit, and the eyes that had not changed in 30 years, still carrying that quality of cold, comprehensive patience, and I said, "Tell me something, Victor. Was it worth it? 30 years? All of it. Was it worth it?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not doubt, nothing as human as doubt. Something more like appetite finally arriving at the thing it had been moving toward for a very long time. "You took 15 years of my life," he said, and his voice dropped to something quiet and precise and completely without heat, which was somehow far more frightening than anger would have been. "You sat above me in your black robe, and you delivered a verdict that destroyed everything I had built, everything I was. And you did it without hesitation, without a single moment of uncertainty, as if my life was simply a problem to be solved and you were the solution." He picked up his scotch again. "Yes, Raymond, it was worth it. Every single day of it was worth it." "And Claire," I said, "was using your own daughter worth it?" For the first time, something flickered across his face that was not entirely controlled. It lasted less than a second, a contraction around the eyes, a tightening of the mouth, and then it was gone, replaced by the same deliberate composure. "Claire made her own choices," he said. "I gave her information. She decided what to do with it. She was 18 years old," I said. "She was an adult," he said flatly. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "See you at the dinner, Victor?" He showed his teeth, not a smile exactly, but the expression that precedes one. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he said. "Bring a pen." I left a bill on the table for the water I hadn't touched, and walked out of Harrington's into the December night. The cold hit me like a reprimand. I walked half a block to a doorway, reached inside my coat, and pressed stop on the recorder. My hand was shaking badly enough that it took me 3 attempts. Not from fear, from 30 years of restrained fury finally pressing hard against the walls I had built to contain it. I pressed my back against the cold brick and breathed through my nose and counted to 10 and then to 20, and then I took out the prepaid phone and sent Frank a single message. He came. Got everything. "Call Sarah tonight." Frank's reply arrived before I had reached the car. "Thank God. Don't go back." I drove home through Georgetown and across Key Bridge with the December River, black and shining, below me, and Victor Ashford's voice still sitting in the recorder against my ribs, like something I had trapped there and would carry until the 15th. Something shifted in the house after my meeting with Victor. I noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure before a storm, not through any single observable event, but through the accumulation of small things that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. Claire became quieter at dinner, her usual careful warmth replaced by a distracted quality, as though part of her attention had been redirected elsewhere and had not fully returned. Daniel disappeared for entire afternoons, without explanation, coming home after dark, with the contained energy of a man who had spent the day doing something he considered productive. And the birthday dinner preparations, which had previously had the pleasant momentum of genuine anticipation, took on a new intensity. Claire confirming arrangements twice that she had already confirmed, checking her phone more frequently than usual, moving through the house with the focused efficiency of someone running a countdown. Frank called me 4 days after Georgetown. I was in the garden, checking the prepaid phone the way I checked it 3 times daily, now a habit I had developed with the same systematic regularity I had once applied to reviewing case files. "The petition has been filed," he said, "officially. Caldwell guardianship matter docketed with the circuit court 2 days ago. Hearing scheduled for December 20th. My hand tightened on the phone. December 20th, 5 days after the birthday dinner. Who's presiding? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell me I was not going to like the answer. Robert Patterson. The name landed in my chest like something dropped from a height. Robert Patterson. 20 years of Friday lunches at the Capitol Grill. 20 years of fishing trips to the Shenandoah. 20 years of a friendship I had believed was among the few genuinely uncomplicated things remaining in my life. My throat closed around whatever I had been about to say, and I stood in Eleanor's winter garden with the phone pressed hard against my ear and breathed through the tightening until I could speak again. "You're certain," I said. My voice came out flat and stripped of everything that wasn't the question itself. "Sarah confirmed it this morning," Frank said quietly. "Ray, I'm sorry. I know what that name means to you." "Does Sarah have anything connecting him to Victor?" "She's working on it. There are financial records suggesting Patterson received a payment through one of the Wyoming LLCs 4 months ago. The amount was significant. Enough to make a man who was looking at retirement on a judge's salary very interested in a very specific outcome." I ended the call. I put the phone in my coat pocket. I stood in the garden for a long time, looking at nothing, letting the December cold work on my face, while something inside me went through a process that I did not have a clean word for. Not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, but the particular quality of pain that comes from understanding that something you built your life around was more fragile than you ever allowed yourself to believe. I called Robert Patterson that evening, from the kitchen from my regular phone while Claire was upstairs. He answered on the second ring, and his voice when he heard mine carried a quality I had never heard in it before, a careful, managed neutrality, as if he had been expecting the call and had rehearsed the version of himself he intended to present. "Ray," he said, "how are you? I've been meaning to reach out." "Have you?" I said, a beat of quiet. "I heard you haven't been feeling well. I'm sorry to hear that." "Robert," I said, keeping my voice completely even, "you've been assigned to my guardianship matter." The quiet that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. "I received the file, yes," he said, finally, his voice careful, as a man walking on ice he does not entirely trust. "It came through standard assignment. I want you to know, Ray, that I've reviewed the medical documentation thoroughly, and I think you've reviewed documentation prepared by people who want my assets," I said. "Medical reports signed by a doctor I have never seen, from a practice I have never visited. I want you to look me in the eye, Robert, and tell me you don't know that." Another silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, the carefully managed neutrality had cracked in a way that revealed something underneath it. Not remorse exactly, but a kind of weary acknowledgement, the sound of a man who had already made it the choice he was going to have to live with and was past the point of reversing it. "Ray, I'm going to handle this matter according to the law and the evidence presented." "Stop," I said. My voice came out harder than I intended, and I did not soften it. "We have known each other for 20 years. I want you to tell me one thing, one honest thing. Was it worth it?" The silence on his end was the loudest thing I had heard in a very long time. "I'll be in touch," he said, and ended the call. I set the phone on the kitchen counter and pressed both palms flat against the tile and stood there with my head down, breathing. The kitchen smelled of the soup Claire had made for dinner, a kindness I had once thought the way she always made sure there was something warm waiting. I understood now that every kindness had been a form of management, and understanding it did not make it hurt any less. It made it hurt in a completely different way. I called Sarah Nolan on the prepaid phone. She answered immediately. "Patterson?" I said. "I know," she said. "We're building the financial connection. It's there, Raymond. It's going to hold. But the timing on the hearing gives us a problem. If Victor believes the legal process is moving forward on schedule, he has less incentive to walk into that dinner and say anything definitive. He'll let the court handle it." My jaw tightened. "So, we need him to believe the court process might fail. We need him to believe that December 15th is his only guaranteed window," Sarah said, "which means between now and then, nothing can look like we know what we know. Everything has to run exactly as they expect." I thought about Patterson's voice on the phone, that careful managed quality, the sound of a man who had sold something he could not buy back. I thought about Victor's still hands on the table at Harrington's. I thought about 35 years of believing that the system I had served would hold, and the particular loneliness of discovering at 72 years old that it held only as well as the people inside it. Raymond, Sarah's voice was steady and direct. I need you to hear me clearly. Patterson, the petition, the hearing, none of it matters after December 15th. If we do this right, there will be no hearing. There will be a federal prosecution, and Robert Patterson's connection to Victor Ashford will be part of it. Something in my chest unclenched by a fraction. How many days? I asked. 10, she said. I looked out the kitchen window at the dark December garden. Eleanor's rose canes were barely visible in the frost light from the back porch, bare stripped back, waiting for a spring that was still 4 months away. But they were there. The roots were there. Whatever had been cut back above the surface had not killed what mattered underneath. 10 days, I said. All right. I ended the call. Upstairs, I could hear Claire moving through the hallway, the particular rhythm of her footsteps that I had known for 25 years, as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. I stood in the kitchen beneath those footsteps and understood with the complete and exhausted clarity of a man who has finally run out of ways to avoid understanding something that the countdown had become the only thing left. Sarah and Frank and I met every morning for 5 days at a location I will not name, and we did not talk about the past. We talked about December 15th, every minute of it, every word that needed to be said, every position, every agent needed to hold. On the morning of December 13th, while Claire took her weekly yoga class, Sarah and 2 technicians entered the house and installed recording equipment in the living room and dining room. I stood in the kitchen and listened to them work and felt the strange suspended quality of a man watching the last pieces of something enormous click into place. Raymond, Sarah found me at the kitchen window when the technicians had finished. Her voice was careful. How are you holding up? I'm fine, I said. She looked at me the way Frank looked at me when he knew I was lying, but understood why. You don't have to be fine, she said. You just have to be ready. Those are the same thing, I said, at 72. She almost smiled. Then she placed a document on the counter beside me, a legal authorization, transferring all evidence I had collected to FBI custody in the event I was unable to continue. Sign here, she said quietly. It's just a precaution. My hand was steady when I signed. I had spent 35 years signing my name to things that change people's lives. This was no different, except that it was entirely different. Frank shook my hand at the door before he left. His grip lasted a beat longer than usual. He started to say something, then stopped, then said, Eleanor would be proud of you, Ray. I want you to know that. My eyes burned so badly I had to look at the ceiling. Don't, I said. Not yet, after. He nodded and left. That night after the house went quiet, I went to the garden. The rose canes were silver with frost under the December moon. I stood beside them and said everything I had been carrying for 5 years, the apologies, the gratitude, the grief that had never properly finished arriving, and the thing underneath all of it that I had never said aloud to anyone, that the 35 years I had spent delivering justice for strangers had sometimes left the people closest to me with less of me than they deserved. That Eleanor had loved me with a completeness I had not always matched, that I was sorry, that I was going to finish what she started. I placed Eleanor's ring against the base of the largest rose cane, held it there for a moment in the frozen earth, then put it back in my pocket. I could not leave it. Not yet. Back inside, I sat at my desk and took out a sheet of paper and wrote a letter to Claire. Not a condemnation, not a verdict. A letter from a father about the February evening she had arrived with her one-eyed rabbit, about the way she had cried for 3 nights, and then on the 4th morning, come down to breakfast and asked Eleanor if she could help make the pancakes. About 25 years of ordinary love that had been real regardless of what had grown alongside it. I sealed the envelope. I left it on the desk. I turned off the light and walked to bed and closed my eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, I did not dream of Eleanor falling. December 15th arrived, the way all significant days do, quietly without ceremony, as if the world had no idea what was about to happen inside that house. I put on the suit Eleanor had bought me for our 40th anniversary. Navy wool, she had said when she gave it to me, makes you look like you still have something to prove. I stood at the bedroom mirror and straightened the tie and told my reflection one more time. Just one more time. Claire was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs arranging flowers in the good crystal vase. She looked up and her face opened with a smile so genuinely warm that it pierced me somewhere I had thought I had successfully armored. You look wonderful, Dad, she said. and her voice broke very slightly on the last word, and I thought she means it. Some part of her means it even now. "Your mother picked this suit," I said. Claire set down the flowers and came to me and straightened my collar with both hands the way Eleanor used to do, and I stood very still and let her, and the ache of it was enormous. "I know," she said softly. She had good taste. We sat down to dinner at 7, Claire, Daniel, and I, with two men I did not acknowledge, knowing moving quietly between the kitchen and the dining room in white catering jackets. Daniel opened the burgundy and poured generously. I accepted my glass with both hands and set it beside my plate. "To Dad." Claire raised her glass, her eyes bright. 72 years of wisdom. We touched glasses. I brought the wine to my lips without drinking. The conversation flowed the way conversations do, when everyone at the table is performing pleasantly a little too smoothly with the slight over-precision of people who have rehearsed their ease. Claire asked about my morning. Daniel talked about a project at work. I answered slowly, smiled at the right moments, asked Claire to pass the bread with the slightly effortful deliberateness of a man who had to think about small tasks. Then Daniel refilled my glass. He leaned across the table with the bottle, and in the moment my attention was apparently on Claire. He tipped something from his closed fist into the wine. A small motion, practiced, invisible to anyone not looking for it. One of the catering men near the sideboard shifted his weight by exactly half a step. He had seen it. It was on camera. I looked at my wine glass. I looked at Daniel's pleasant waiting face. I looked at Claire, who was describing the florist on King Street with the animated detail of someone filling space with words because the space needed filling. "Before we continue," I said, and set my napkin on the table, "I'd like to show you both something." Claire stopped mid-sentence. Daniel's pleasant expression held for exactly 1 second longer than it should have. "I've been keeping something," I said, "that I think it's time we all looked at together." I reached into the inside pocket of the navy suit, the suit Eleanor had chosen, because it made me look like I still had something to prove, and I took out the remote control for the television screen mounted above the dining room fireplace. Before I could press the button, the front doorbell rang. Claire looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his watch. And then Claire stood up, smoothing her dress, and said in a voice that had shed every layer of performance and arrived at something I could only call relief. "Right on time." She walked to the front door. I heard it open. I heard her say, "You're right on time." And then I heard footsteps on the marble floor of the hallway, slow, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had been waiting 30 years to make this particular entrance. I straightened the lapel of Eleanor's suit. I stood up from the table. And Victor Ashford walked into my dining room. I stepped into the dining room the way I had once stepped into my courtroom, deliberately, with the full weight of everything I knew pressing behind my eyes. Victor saw me first. His smile arrived exactly on schedule, broad and certain, the smile of a man collecting something that had always belonged to him. "Happy birthday, Raymond," he said. "You look well." "Thank you for coming, Victor," I said. "Please sit down." He sat at the head of my table, as if the chair had been waiting for him. Claire moved to his right. Daniel stood near the sideboard, his hands working against each other in a way he was not aware of. The two men in catering jackets continued moving quietly around the room. Victor looked around the dining room with the unhurried satisfaction of a man taking inventory of something he was about to own. "Beautiful house," he said. "Eleanor had good taste." The sound of her name in his mouth made something in my chest catch fire. I kept my face completely composed. "She did," I said. "She also had good instincts. She found something 30 years after you put your daughter in my home that cost her everything." I paused. "You know that, don't you, Victor? You know what Claire did to stop her." Victor's smile didn't waver. "I know Eleanor had an accident," he said. "Tragic." "Say that again," I said quietly. "Clearly." He leaned back entirely at ease and said, "A terrible accident, nothing more." I picked up the remote. I pressed play. The television above the fireplace came to life. The hallway, the staircase, Eleanor in her blue robe, the papers against her chest, Claire moving toward her, the argument, 1 second, 1 motion. Claire made a sound I had never heard from her before, a sharp involuntary exhalation, as if she had been struck physically. Her hands flew to her mouth. Tears broke down her face before she could stop them. Daniel took 2 steps toward the door. One of the catering agents moved to block him. Daniel's face went the color of old plaster. Victor watched the screen without expression. When the video ended, he said, "A security camera operated by a dead housekeeper." Any attorney in the country will have that excluded in 20 minutes. You're right, I said. One piece of evidence rarely wins a case. I reached into my breast pocket and placed a small recording device on the table. But a confession does, particularly one in which the subject explains in his own words his motive, his method, and his 30-year plan. I looked at him steadily. You were very thorough at Harrington's, Victor. December 3rd. You remembered everything. For the first time in 30 years, Victor Ashford's face lost its composure. The certainty drained out all of it the way color drains from a face in shock, not all at once, but irrevocably. You took 15 years of my life, I said, borrowing his own words back to him. Everything you built, everything you were. You wanted me to hear that. Now, everyone will. Victor's hands pressed flat against the table. His voice, when it came, was stripped of everything except its oldest, hardest core. You destroyed me, Raymond. Everything I had. Say it clearly, Victor, I said. One more time. His jaw tightened. His eyes burned with 30 years of compressed fury. And then, because men like Victor cannot ultimately resist the verdict they have always believed was coming, he said it. I planned every part of this. From the day I walked out of that courtroom, every single part, and I would do it again. The kitchen door opened. Sarah Nolan walked in with 2 agents behind her. Victor Ashford. She said, "You are under arrest for conspiracy wire fraud and criminal administration of a controlled substance. You have the right to remain silent." Victor stood. His hands were steady even as the agents moved to either side of him. He looked at me one final time, across the dinner table, and what I saw in his face then was not rage and not defeat, but something older than either, the exhausted recognition of a man who had finally arrived at the end of something he had been building his whole life and found it empty. "You planned this," he said. "No," I said. "You planned this. 30 years ago, I simply read your plan more carefully than you expected." They led him out through the front door. Daniel was taken through the kitchen. Claire sat at the table with both hands over her face, her shoulders shaking with the kind of crying that has nowhere left to hide. I looked at her for a long moment, and then I walked past her through the hallway and out into the December garden. They took Victor and Daniel to the Federal Building downtown. Claire was detained separately, standard procedure, Sarah told me, as she walked me to her car through the December night. I rode without speaking. The city lights blurred past the windows like something seen through water. It was almost midnight on my 72nd birthday, and I felt every one of those years in the marrow of my bones, not as weight exactly, but as presence, the accumulated substance of a life that had just arrived at the end of something very long. Sarah drove. At a red light on Constitution Avenue, she said without looking away from the road, "You did well tonight, Raymond. I want you to know that." "Did we get everything?" I asked. "Everything," she said. Victor's confession on record, Daniel's arrest, the financial evidence chain, Patterson's connection confirmed through the LLC records. She paused. "It's over." I pressed my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes for exactly 10 seconds. Then I opened them because there was still one thing left to do. At the Federal Building, Sarah led me to a small room with a table and 2 chairs and a window that looked into an adjacent room where Claire was sitting, with her hands folded on the table and a federal attorney beside her. Sarah asked if I wanted a few minutes with Claire before the formal interview began. I said yes. I walked into that room alone. Claire looked up when I entered. Her eyes were swollen and raw, her makeup long gone, her hair coming loose from where she had pinned it for the dinner. She looked young, in a way she hadn't looked in years, stripped of everything she had been performing, down to something that was just a person, sitting in a hard chair at midnight with nowhere left to go. I sat down across from her and placed the envelope on the table between us, the letter I had written the night before. "I wrote this before the dinner," I said. "I want you to have it." She stared at the envelope. Her hands moved toward it and then stopped, trembling, hovering above the table. "Why?" she whispered, and her voice was wrecked, completely scraped, raw, barely audible. "Because 25 years was real," I said. "Whatever else is true that was real. The February night you came home with us, the 4 years of bedtime stories, the morning you made pancakes with Eleanor and burned every single one, and she framed the worst one and hung it in the kitchen. Those things happened. They belong to you. No verdict changes that." Claire pressed both hands over her eyes, and her shoulders shook with a crying that had no sound in it, the deepest kind, the kind that has gone past the body's ability to make noise. Her breath came in broken waves. She pressed her fingers into her eye sockets hard, as if she could push the tears back in, and she couldn't, and she kept trying anyway. I didn't, she started and started again. At the beginning, I thought Victor told me you had ruined him deliberately, that you had other options and you chose the harshest one because you wanted to make an example. Her voice fractured on the last word. I was 18. I believed him. I know, I said. I knew it wasn't true anymore, she said, and the admission came out of her like something that had been trapped under pressure for a very long time. I knew it years ago. I didn't know how to stop. I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. They were cold and shaking badly. I hope one day you find your way back, I said. Not to me, just back. To whoever you were before he got to you. She cried harder at that, a sound finally breaking through a single ragged sob that filled the small room completely. I held her hands until the worst of it passed. Then I stood up because there was nothing else I could give her that would not cost more than either of us had left, and what remained needed to be hers to carry. I walked out without looking back. Sarah drove me home at 2 a.m. The house was dark and very quiet. I went through the kitchen without turning on any lights out through the back door into Eleanor's garden. The December night was clear for the first time in weeks, genuinely clear with stars visible above the roofline and the frost on the rose canes catching the light, like something deliberately beautiful. I knelt beside the largest cane, the one Eleanor had planted the year we moved in, and called her Anchor Rose because she said every garden needed one thing that refused to die. I took her ring from my breast pocket. I pressed it into the cold earth at the base of the cane, not burying it, just placing it there, the way you place something at a grave when you want the person to know you came. It's done, Ellie, I said. My voice was steady and very quiet in the clear December air. It's finally done, I heard you. I'm sorry it took me so long. I stayed there on my knees in the frost for a long moment. Then I picked the ring back up and put it in my pocket because I was not ready to leave it behind. And I thought Eleanor, who had always known me better than I knew myself, would understand. Inside on the kitchen counter, the prepaid phone buzzed. Frank's message read, Patterson suspended pending judicial conduct review. Guardianship filing dismissed. All accounts frozen. It's over, Ray. Get some sleep. I set the phone down. I stood in my kitchen in the dark for a moment, with the December cold still on my coat, and Eleanor's ring in my pocket, and 30 years of a man's patience finally irrevocably answered. Then I walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The Anchor Rose stood in the frost, and the starlight stripped back and bare and entirely alive underneath. In 4 months it would bloom again. I thought I might be there to see it. I have spent 35 years delivering verdicts for other people. But the most important verdict of my life was not delivered in a courtroom. It was delivered in a winter garden, on my knees in the frost, with my dead wife's ring in my hand, and 30 years of damage finally mercifully answered. Here is what I know now that I did not know before family betrayal does not announce itself. It arrives slowly, wearing the face of love, speaking in the voice of care, until the day you realize that the warmth you trusted was never warmth at all. It was strategy. I should have looked more carefully. I should have listened when Eleanor tried to tell me. I should have understood that the people closest to us are not automatically the people safest to trust. If this family story has taught me anything worth passing on, it is this: do not wait until you are 72 years old and standing in a winter garden to ask the hard questions. Do not let grief make you blind. Do not let love make you careless. I made those mistakes so that perhaps you will not have to make them yourself. I believe, and God has given me enough years to believe this, with some confidence that truth does not disappear simply because we are afraid to look at it. It waits. It is patient. And in the end, it finds its way into the light, regardless of how carefully someone has tried to bury it. This is my family story. This is my family betrayal. And this is my family story of how one old man learned almost too late that justice begins at home. If any part of this touched something in you, leave a word in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that truth still matters, subscribe and stay with us for what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories that follow contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and understanding. If this type of content is not for you, we respect that. Completely step away and find what speaks to your heart instead. But if you choose to stay, we promise to make it worth your time.